So this is the last chapter on replication, transparency, and real-world importance. So those three issues are what we're going to talk about in this chapter. I want to go into replication in a little bit more depth. I want to go into transparency of research in a little bit more depth, and about the need or lack thereof of external validity. But first, replication. We've talked about replication before. If you come across a finding, you'd probably wonder whether it's replicable or reproducible, right? If you come across a finding and it hasn't been reproduced, you would assume that it's a fluke, right? If you were to read that one study showed that the medicine worked, but 4 other such studies have shown that the medicine didn't work, you would assume that there's something wrong with the one study that showed that the medicine worked, because we have 4 non-results, right? Right, so replication is a really important step in the research process. So whenever a researcher does a study again, either their own research study or some other researcher's study, it's called a replication study. So there are 3 major types of replication studies. Direct replication studies, conceptual replication studies, and what we may call replication plus extension studies. So in a direct replication study, as you can probably guess, that means that the study is literally repeated, just with different subjects, but all the research parameters are the same. So consider this example. You remember this study from chapter, what was it, 10, I think, where babies watched a model put effort into getting a toy out of a cage, or no effort into putting a toy pulling a toy out of a cage. And then researchers measured how many times the babies pushed the button on a device, on a box, to see if the button did anything. Right, the button didn't do anything. Remember that? And so babies who watched a model do effort actually did more button pushes than babies who watched the model put in no effort. So in this paper, the researchers immediately tried to replicate their own study to see if it was valid. And these were their results. So as you can see, the numbers aren't exactly the same, right? But the conclusion is the same, in the sense that after babies watched a model put in effort, they pushed the button more times than after babies watched a model put no effort. Another example of a study that we talked about that's been replicated a lot of times is the study where people who engage in more deep talk tend to also have a higher subjective well-being, right? Remember that? So they replicated that finding a bunch of times too, although with different populations, right? So they replicated it with younger people and with older people, and you may argue that's not a exact direct replication, but the research finding is the same. So what does direct replication tell us? Of course, it tells us that the original finding is highly unlikely to be a simple fluke, right? But it doesn't, increase our knowledge as such, because you could argue, well, there's the original finding and we already knew that based on the original finding. No, yes, true, but we are now more confident of the original finding. But let's say that the original finding tried to test a theory, right? We haven't learned anything new about that particular theory, right? We haven't tested the theory in a new context. So that's what we use conceptual replications for. So in what is called a conceptual replication, researchers explore the same research question, but they use different procedures. For instance, they operationalize the variables in different ways, right? So we're testing the same variables, just operationalized in different ways. testing the same research question. Right? It's not an exact replication, but it's a replication in concept, so it's a conceptual replication. An example. You remember the study that we described earlier, where they tested whether alcohol-related stimuli can prime aggressive thoughts. Remember that? They showed alcohol-related photos or plant-related photos, and immediately after each photo they presented a word, an aggression-related word or a neutral word, and they measured reaction time. Right? And it showed that the fastest reaction times were found to aggression-related words when these were immediately preceded by or primed by alcohol-related photos. So the second study tested the same idea but in a different way. They had people watch advertisements, either alcohol advertisements or advertisements for control products, and then that primed people's thoughts about alcohol, and then as a dependent variable they had not as a dependent variable, but that as a second stimulus they had people read an anecdote about Donald and his behavior. And Donald's behavior was ambiguous. It could be interpreted as aggressive or it could not. For instance, refusing to pay the rent. That could be interpreted as hostile. And how people rated that behavior, so we then asked people about that behavior and we measured how hostile they thought that behavior was. Right? So it's the same question that's being examined here, just in totally different ways, with totally different stimuli and a totally different independent and a totally different dependent variable. But it's the same idea that's being tested, so you can consider this a conceptual replication. Psychology is full of conceptual replication studies. So yeah, people interpreted Donald's behavior as more hostile when they had just seen alcohol advertisements compared to when they had just seen advertisements for a control product. Another type of replication is when psychologists replicate a study, but they add stuff. Add yet more variables or more conditions. So you remember, for instance, the study where students take notes on laptops or on pen and paper, and then they were tested their memory for factual information versus conceptual information. So one replication added a no-note condition, a baseline condition in other words, students didn't take notes at all, and took notes on an e-writer, like a notepad. And these were the results. And, by the way, lo and behold, this particular study did not replicate the effect where people on longhand performed better than people on a laptop. Several studies have replicated it, but a few, including this one, have not. Make of that what you will. The jury is still out. Right? Replication studies don't always replicate the original finding. And now in this case, like I said, there have been a bunch of replications and a bunch of studies have replicated it, a few studies have not. But the point is that, the point of a replication plus extension study is that we've added some conditions to the original study. It is in a way a complete replication, but a replication but with some added conditions. So in recent years, replication studies have become very common. There have been some large-scale efforts to replicate certain influential findings in psychology that haven't come up with anything. And so this highlights the importance of replication. Right, so now it's very common, but it wasn't so long ago that replication wasn't very common. 10, 20 years ago only, replication wasn't very common. So for instance, you may have heard about the facial feedback hypothesis, right, as part of your intro psych class. According to the facial feedback hypothesis, our brain takes information from our face into account when it creates the experience of emotion. So in other words, that would predict that merely smiling or merely frowning would increase your feelings of happiness or grumpiness respectively. So that's the initial study tested this by having people wear a pen in their mouth while they were doing their task, and then after the task rate how happy they were. And they had to wear that pen either in between their teeth like this, or in between their lips like this, right? So either smiling or frowning. And in the original study, it was found that people, after they had their pen in their teeth and they were smiling, were happier than people who had their pen in their lips and were frowning, were more grumpy. Right? There was support for the facial feedback hypothesis. Now, a whole bunch of labs together tried to replicate that finding in a multinational replication attempt. And these were their results. This is the confidence interval for each lab's result. And as you can see, 0 is included in every confidence interval. So the results of these many replication studies suggest that the original finding was indeed a fluke. Right here on the graph is 0. Each line is a confidence interval for each study. Right, and as you can see, each line piece includes 0. So the difference in happiness between people who smile and people who didn't smile in each of these studies was no different than 0. In another mass replication study, researchers recruited 36 labs from around the world, and each lab was assigned 16 simple studies from psychology to replicate. Right? So for instance, this first one, which was the original study was by Jankovic and Kahneman, and it was about anchoring. Like if you prime people with a number, that'll influence their estimates. So people were asked one of two questions. Right? So one group of people was asked, fewer than 50,000 babies are born per day in the United States. How many babies do you think are born in the US each day? The other half were asked, more than 100 babies are born per day in the United States. How many babies do you think are born in the US each day? Right? So one group was primed with fewer than 50,000. The other group was primed with more than 100. So it's a common finding that this kind of what's called anchoring biases people's estimates. In the sense that people who've just heard 50,000 make their estimate much higher than people who just heard 100. So that's this first study. And this is the effect size of the original study. And each study could replicate this. In fact, the effect sizes of each of the 16 labs, of each of the 36 labs was higher than the original study. In this particular mass replication attempt, most of the studies could be very well replicated, right, by these 36 labs. But note, not all of them. Also note that these labs were from all around the world and that location didn't actually matter in the degree to which they could replicate these simple findings. Which is, promising if anything, or rather reassuring.